Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats.
It's a line from my favorite film. No matter where you go, there you are. And if you're here with us, you must be in the seats with once more. As always, my name is Dave Voigt. I am your host for this affair. And as always, don't forget to follow us on Podomatic, on Apple Podcasts, and you can find us on YouTube as well. And not to mention, check us out on all our social media platforms, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, at In the Seats. For today's episode, we're talking with director Anthony Dimaria about his new documentary, Jay Sebring, Cutting to the Truth, which really dives into the sort of true aspect of, well, I don't want to say true. True is probably the wrong word, because it really shows how there was some pretty stark media manipulation at the time, and how Jay Sebring's name kind of got dragged through the mud, and just how sort of these Manson murders really became a cottage industry by dehumanizing the victims, which, when it comes to a mass murder, is kind of disgusting, but it's something that we do all the time. And full disclosure, Anthony Dimaria, the director, it was Jay Sebring's nephew, so he definitely had sort of a personal stake in telling this story right. And up to date, I think it's been one of our more interesting conversations. So enough of me. Why don't we take a listen?
How you doing today, man?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for the time, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now, obviously, congratulations on the film. I mean, obviously, your motivations for doing it are pretty obvious, but why? Walk me through the moment when you decided it had to be you to do it, as opposed to handing off the story to somebody else.
Yeah, that's actually a great question, because it was really an evolutionary process. And when I say it was evolutional, it from a very early age, I just wanted to see him again. He left that impact on me. And so when I saw the pain in my mother's eyes, when I talked about him, then I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to cause my mother that pain. So in my own way, I went through kind of like an odyssey to know the truth about my uncle, because as I got older, I started reading things that were really disturbing, nauseating, actually. And I became determined to know the truth, whether I liked the truth or not. And I realized that I had to do that. So even through adolescence and reading the books and Helter Skelter and all these things, and I went to USC and I did some research in the Cinema Special Collections Library. I read Time Magazine and all these other things. And I thought, could it be possible that Jay was actually these things, And I had to know. So I continued to read and research everything I could in my own personal way. But then I would say around 1999, I was living in New York City, and a book came out called Sharon Tate and the Manson Murders by Greg King. And then I read it, and there's a whole chapter called Jay. And I'm reading these things that completely were absolutely categorically false, and not only false, the opposite of who Jay was. Saying, insinuating that there was a disinheritance between the family of Jay, and completely not true. It was the exact opposite, as the film shows. And then I just, that was a fire. I thought, why is all this entrenched kind of narratives? It's being regurgitated and packaged and sold and consumed to epic proportions. And then Dominic Dunn wrote a piece in Vanity Fair. And when I read that, it wasn't about the murders. It was about Jay Sebring, his Beverly Hills, barber. Then I was encouraged, and I said, you know what? And I started to learn things, that Jay's story is much larger, much more relevant in a cultural and historical context than, dare I say, even anything the murders have been kind of propped up as.
No, for sure. I would absolutely agree with you on that, because I mean, as you show in the film, there is this sort of cultural shift when he comes on the scene, and like you say, it's not necessarily about being a barber, it's about being a stylist, and sort of changing how so many of the iconic Hollywood stars sort of look and present themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, he was so transformative in what he did. I mean, pre-Sebring, men went to barbers. I mean, you literally walked in a barbershop, you got a haircut in 10, 15 minutes. They did clippers. They, patted it, smacked it down with Brill cream and petroleum jellies.
For sure.
So you'd pick one of, those 10 cuts, flat top, a part on your left, a part on your right, a business cut, a butch cut, and that was it. What Jay did is he created the custom cut by utilizing what was reserved for women to men. And if a man had a huge nose, from the profile, you wouldn't want to cut it too short to the occipital in the back, because then it would be you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And what he did, it was so transformative that even people like Stanley Kubrick hired Jay to literally design the look of Spartacus, in which Kirk Douglas played.
Right.
And then ultimately, Elektra Records also hired Jay to literally transform Jim Morrison's image from a roadhouse rocker into like a rock and roll sex symbol, which that cut is just as iconic today as even then.
Now, I mean, obviously this is a lifetime of research for you, but I mean, it does feel like, especially when we're just talking about what he did and sort of his impact on Hollywood, was that the fun part of making this? Because I mean, there are some elements in the film that I can, at least from my perspective, for you as a filmmaker, it's like you're taking pride in telling these stories. You're enjoying telling these stories.
I started researching, as I said, researching my whole life, really, but
Right.
cognitively saying, I'm going to tell Jay's story for over 20 years. And initially it was going to be a dramatic narrative, but then I thought, with all the iconic, these legends of Hollywood of the 60s, I knew that there would be a challenge. Like, I didn't want the audience saying, is that supposed to be Sinatra? That doesn't look like McQueen. Is that Bruce Lee? I just didn't, that wasn't, and Jay needed to be his own focus.
Yeah.
And of his own story. And so that's when I determined it was going to be a documentary. But, we were independently produced, and by the way, shout outs to my executive producer, Chad Lane, and Boss Beretta, and certainly Johnny Bishop, who is my producer, editor, cinematographer. I mean, we've been at war, and we started filming in 2008. So it's been a 12-year filming process. And also, Jeff Beal, our composer, it was a very kind of serendipitous process, because we had a lot of trouble with challenges, sometimes with technical aspects, some other challenges in funding. So I don't know that I was so focused on telling Jay's story, and actually I wasn't telling Jay's story at all. As you see in the structure of the film, it was the people who were there. They are telling it. I'm not telling
Correct.
anybody.
No, you're right. Yeah.
So I, to your point, and I think it's a very interesting question. I've never been asked that before. Yes, I was completely inspired and moved by what I learned when I saw Dennis Hopper and Nancy Sinatra and Quincy Jones getting emotional, and the love and respect that they felt for Jay. I mean, these are people who inspired me from childhood as an artist, even, dare I call myself an artist, but you see what I'm saying? I mean,
Totally.
People,
yeah.
these people were doing profound things, and here they are. I see that they're looking at him as almost as like they're in a revered way, because he had that impact on Hollywood, and very few people know that. And I'm happy to say that that historical context, I think people will see that in the film. That Jay he wasn't incidental to, a celebrity hairstyles.
Sure, yeah.
He wasn't hitting it. He was the sensei focus to them.
Yeah. And I mean, it's one of those things, because I mean, historically, Hollywood has always loved to talk about itself and tell stories about itself. But as much as this story has been told, it's not a story that ever gets told properly. And I'm kind of curious, from your perspective, why do you think that is?
Again, that's a fantastic question, because I think there is a cultural, there's almost a psychology behind it all, an anatomy. So whether it be about, typical some people in Hollywood, which I think there's a lot of great aspects of Hollywood. I've been fortunate to work with some really phenomenal people. But sometimes it's about self-aggrandizement, and sometimes it's about profit. Sometimes it's really about telling a relevant and important story. But with regard to sensational, notorious true crime, which clearly is its own industry, but I feel that, not that I feel, the Manson murders have become their own cottage industry, their own cash cow. And people perceive it as such. And I have to say that there are so many filmmakers, writers, people of books, of documentaries and everything that treat it as a cash cow. And there's a dramatic structure that has to take place when packaging and selling such narratives, especially notorious, horrific true crime. And the first thing that a writer, a producer, anything, magazines, is you have to strip the victim of their humanity.
Yeah.
Because once you do that, I can have fun. I can sell this. I can exploit it, all guilt-free. And then the people who really, now that's something that I also learned. There were so many things that were revelatory in this, but for so long I blamed exploitative media platforms. And I learned that it's actually a very intrinsic symbiotic relationship between the packager, the seller, and the consumer.
Yeah.
And there are certain types of people that really enjoy this, and for lack of a better word or words, get off on it.
Yeah.
So now if this person isn't a pregnant woman,
Yeah.
if they're not like my brother, my sister, like me, or my families, then, and if they're somehow either intrinsic to being killed and that it's not random, we have to make reasons for this. Why did this happen? Oh, because if I make sense of it, then that insulates me from the same horrific random fate happening to my family and I in the middle of the night. So there's all these things. And I think also specific to the Manson narratives and portrayals is a profound subtext of morality tales. So at first, when this happened, the fabric of the times of the 60s, I mean, there was so much happening in terms of kind of so-called traditional values being challenged by the youth movements. But here were these people where there was a joint, some other things found, and you know what? These people were doing drugs. And there was a rope, and then they found out in a polygraph that there's someone talking about some sort of tying up and all this. So then it became a ritualistic BDSM thing.
Yeah.
But the narrative was, if you smoke pot and if you have a healthy sex life beyond just maybe say the missionary position,
Right.
I don't know,
Yeah.
then you're going to get killed in the middle of the night. And that was the narrative. Don't be like that hippie Hollywood jet set. And a lot of people really enjoyed seeing that and seeing these beautiful people doing significant things getting struck down. But the other morality tale, and I don't, is the Manson people. The morality tale with regard to them, they have been referred to as a hippie cult. You know how many millions of hippie communes across this country were going on at the time? But they didn't go out and murder sprees. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly, yeah.
So it wasn't a hippie cult. They weren't followers. They were a very extensive, violent crime organization. Their crimes went from late 67 all the way through 1974.
Yeah. Crazy. And I mean, there is that voyeuristic aspect too of people wanting to experience it but not necessarily experience it. And I mean, I think that really comes through on the bit in the film with the t-shirts with his face, but it doesn't necessarily have the swastika, because obviously if you have the swastika, then you're a bad person. But
but you can kill a bunch of people.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's this fascination with the horrible, but trying to draw a line between, this is only kind of horrible, but no, horrible is horrible. And we tend to forget that.
That's such an important point. And I love that my family, but like my sister, she was able to articulate that so well. But it really is true. It's like, hey, racism is horrible. And so is murder. But how that whoever it was packaging this and saying, you know what, lose the swastika, not good. We can't sell the picture on that. And so it really shows the twisted, perverted degrees people will go to package and exploit. It's sickening. It's disgusting.
Really is. Now, I mean, obviously, from a pop culture standpoint, this story is a little bit more in sort of the ethos thanks to Quentin's film. But I'm kind of curious from your perspective, not only just in terms of portrayal and giving us sort of this alternate reality, an alternate universe where these people are just characters and they're people and they have value, but do you think you could have released do you think the documentary would maybe even be having as much impact pre that movie as it does now post?
That's a great question. I don't know, but certainly Quentin has an impact, obviously a profound seismic impact on pop culture and even in all his films. So it's a good question, but I think it's a question, it's a hypothetical I can't quite answer, because I really feel that, first of all, what Quentin did, and I have to say I was very impressed with both he and Shannon McIntosh as film, makers, and also as people, because they showed a very significant amount of care and consideration for our family's concerns, because I had reached out to them wanting to express these concerns, because after 50 years of exploitation and literally not just marginalizing, but vilifying and the character assassination of the victims, I was really concerned what this film might be when I learned that Jay and Sharon would be characters, that the Manson people, I just didn't know. But I also knew that what he would do would have more of an impact culturally than, say, any of the other previous things. So we met 2 times and spoke for hours each time, and like maybe an hour and a half each time. And then we did the interview on set at Jay's actual old shop, So, but I was impressed with them. And the impact that I really appreciate was that for the first time in 50 years, they treated Jay and Sharon and obviously Wojtek and Abigail are in the film, but as people, not as being incidental or relevant because they had been killed in a notorious murder. And that was very encouraging to see. And that was a first. And so on that level, I can speak to, and I do appreciate that. And sure, it was great to have Quentin share his insight and what he learned in the research of Jay. Especially it was interesting his pre-filming, or what he knew about Jay pre and then after.
Right.
So great insight.
No, for sure. And I mean, I love how the film also at least does try to maintain a certain degree of objectivity, because obviously he was your uncle, this is family, this is an important story for you, but people on the outside looking in may not have been surprised if you had sort of brushed away some of the rumors or some of the more sensationalist things, be they true, be they not, who the hell cares, quite frankly. But just sort of the nonsense, like, I'm trying to find the right way to word this. There was so much nonsense and fake news, I hate to use that word, but that was printed about Jay and Sharon and what happened, and it could have been very easy for you to just sort of quickly reference it and dismiss it, but you really did go into it in detail. Was that important for you to be able to show how sensationalized this all really was?
You know what? You can't do a valid portrayal, a candid portrayal of somebody if you're candid coding or doing a tribute in any way whatsoever. And the amazing thing to what you're asking is that as much as I learned over the years, the red flags that popped up were shocking. All the drug addict, drug dealing, all that. He had no drugs in it. Well, I don't want to give too many things away. And then this whole thing with the polygraph. And of course, there's a rope at the scene. So that's when detectives, frankly, is it coincidental that it's in a major national news publication days after the polygraph? How did that information get there? So the point is that people were trying to make sense of all of this. It wasn't what happened. It was, why did this happen? So the victims were put on the stand, and that was the obvious thing. So what has been a continual kick in the gut, in my teeth over the years, is how Jay has been constantly, people didn't really know what he did other than saying he was a celebrity hairstylist, which is actually offensive if we look at what he really did. Now, being a celebrity hairstylist is really phenomenal, right?
Yeah.
Now, that's a disparagement on them. But it also is, this is a man who created an industry. He was defining the times, that not only was he trend setting, but he was doing it in a timeless nature. It was, you know what I'm saying? So it was important. And Johnny Bishop and I, we spoke about this extensively. We always kept our eye on the goal, which is Jay's life story. And part of Jay's life story, especially as, like you said, as a blood relative in all these years, seeing how his own murder had been treated as a form of entertainment every year. We're talking dozens of times. So some people might say, well, you were really young. Well, how could you remember? And how could you have been so impacted? Well, first of all, it's a complete disconnect from how a murder could impact a family. It's an amazing thing that somebody could even say that. However, also being that young and throughout the years, seeing that my uncle's life and murder was like pop culture bubblegum, and people were making money, and they know more the Manson people by in the familiar. It's Tex, it's Lulu, it's Sadie, it's Charlie. How did that happen?
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate that point, though, because I had to really look into who was Jay. And, you know, for some of the lurid tales, like there are little clues in the film where even when you see the film, you'll see the word during a polygraph once.
Right.
Okay. So is that establishing a history? No, it's actually revealing something insightful of that it happened once. And so that I'll leave it to the audience to see that. And it's also interesting in some of the narratives, if there was such a conflicted, troubled, dark person with something to hide, he sure had a hell of a lot of friends.
Yeah.
He sure had a heck of a lot of beautiful women wanting to spend a lot of time with him. So whatever he was doing, it seemed to be working. So, I mean, you see what I'm saying? I mean,
I absolutely do. Yeah.
that's the proof in the pudding. And you know, that was yet one of those other examples. I was like, wait a minute, this is what's being said, and this is what is actually happening. And again, a lot of that came in with so many of the other allegations in the film that, you know, are I don't want to say addressed, but we just cover them and let the people, you know, let the viewer think for themselves, decide for themselves.
For sure. And I mean, like you said previously, like true crime, especially at this stage, is its own cottage industry. And I'm kind of curious from your perspective, because obviously there have been heinous crimes and other victims that have been sensationalized in the press, and the press that have manipulated anything to sort of sell papers and whatnot. But I'm kind of curious, from your perspective, is this the first time that maybe from a pop culture standpoint that we've kind of noticed the manipulation of the story?
Wow, that's a great question. I don't know. Once people see this film, maybe that it will have that impact. And I think it should, because one thing that the film does, and this is not just my opinion, but it really does set a historical record straight. And people might say, well, scratch their heads and say, well, why did I believe this? And why was it, you know, believed in different circles that this happened? And so I sure hope so. You know, this is a historical event.
Yeah.
And even though the murders are one chapter of Jay's life, and it's always been the opposite. It's the murders and the victims just happen to be a chapter in this. So let's get to the good shit stuff. Let's get to the blood and guts.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's like, don't let the facts get in the way of a great story. Well, this film are the facts. And it's, again, this is not my opinion. I'm not a blood relative who's got, you know, something to, you know, I'm just asking people questions. And with regard to the segment, you know, with the one book, you know, the DA's book, Dave, we interviewed upwards of 8, if we include Jay's childhood friends at a reunion, which didn't even make it in the film, we're talking upwards of 90 people who actually knew Jay. And that's not including the authorities, the cultural, historical authorities, and the forensic people. I had them read that, and there was not one, I mean, shockingly, there was not one person that said, oh, you know what? Yeah, that was Jay, yeah, that was true. And that's why I literally would give them a book and let them read it, or I would read it to them. And it was shocking, the response. And, you know, I think when people realize, like as a blood relative, and so many, I know that all of the families that we've met over the years, and I've spoken to some of the Folger family, Stephen Parent's family, the LaBianca families, and certainly wanted to talk to Gary Hinman's cousin. I've reached out, and initially I was going to have a chapter of each of the victims.
Yeah.
But the problem is, first of all, Jay's story is so pregnant and dense that it just, you know, we had to cut down 5 hours into 91 minutes. And
wow. Okay.
And we literally have hundreds of hours of footage, and there's stories in there that didn't even make the cut that are, in some cases, hilarious, in other cases, you know, very relevant and touching. But, you know, the other problem with that, because I've always been cognizant of the other families and the other victims, obviously, but there were some family members that I couldn't find any living members. There were other family members whom didn't want to be interviewed, and then there were some that I did interview, and we have those interviews. And so I realized it wouldn't be fair if all the victims didn't have the same resource material, you know. But if we look at like Joan Benet Ramsey, and I hate to even say the Black Dahlia, it's sickening that the woman's not known for her name. And it's Elizabeth Short, right? Her name is Elizabeth Short, I'm pretty sure.
I think so, yeah.
And so if you look at the narratives, in the Manson to epic proportions, the narratives and the different dramatic structures practically that were contrived and molded is the same thing that happened to those poor victims and their families. And so if you're gonna sell on every single tabloid magazine in America the torture, strangulation of a 6-year-old girl, you're not gonna put a picture of her blowing out her candles. You're not gonna put a picture of her in her class picture or with her family, you know, opening presents or whatever. She's gotta be a weird kid. And that's exactly what they did, because bad things happen to weird kids. And that it really is sickening. And the same thing with Elizabeth Short, in that, oh, here's this young actress wannabe coming to Hollywood, can't quite cut it, and then she tries to leech off of older men and steal their money. Well, you know what happens to women like that. And do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And it's sickening. And sadly with these, it's, and I think like when I've seen, and even some of the other very sensational, there's been so many of them, and I watch them on the news sometimes, and then I'll see their families, and I really does break my heart, because I think those poor people, because I know what is in store for them, and how such a personal, painful, private tragedy that will last a lifetime is going to be played out as tabloid fodder.
Yeah. No, I mean, I've got to imagine, I mean, and like you mentioned, the editing process on this is gargantuan, to say the least. Can we look forward to a film of Hollywood stories of all the stuff that you may have left on the cutting room floor? Because I can imagine if you're shooting with a Quincy or a Dennis Hopper, you just got the camera up and you're like, okay, just don't let the tape run out. Don't let the tape run out. Just keep going.
It's extraordinary, because we talked with David Milch, and I actually was fortunate to work on a couple of his shows. And in doing that, and I've mentioned this because I got to see the way David's mind works. He's one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. I mean, and I knew that he would be able to describe what was happening in the 60s, because he was there, and he was, kind of expressing himself, as many people were, within the context of the 60s, but also about the media and about specific, and he was brilliant. And shoot, I lost my train of thought on that. You asked, what did you just ask?
Oh, just in terms of
yeah, so
good Hollywood stories, yeah.
Yeah. So David went on, and we interviewed him for I don't know how long, and Quincy Jones for two and a half hours, yeah. And Quentin, he was on the lunch break on the set, so, and he was extremely generous, and I kept looking over, and I'm like, Quentin, are we okay? I mean, and he goes, that's okay. Okay, when we get there, I'll let you know. I mean, yeah, let's keep talking. And anyway, but like David, we started talking about like the Cuba Missile Crisis and John F. Kennedy and that whole thing. I mean, it's like a 20-minute, very insightful history lesson. Wow. I mean, and so, I mean, that's just some of the stories that are extraordinary that, you know, that didn't make it, but even specific to Jay's story. I mean, it's, and Chad Lane, but you know, my dear family friend and executive producer, we watched the screening. And he goes, Ian, what happened to the? And I can't even say it because it was a little. He goes, what happened to this scene? What the hell happened to that? I love that scene. I was like, man, we couldn't keep it in because it took us out of the context of this, right. And we had to. So there really is some pretty, you know, interesting scenes that didn't quite make it. So yes, I mean, trust me, if somebody has any interest in doing, you know, a longer cut. Or even that, a couple people have reached out to me about books. And so in that, certainly everything would be in that. And I think we could go even more expansively, not just with the details. I mean, Jay was, as you could see, he was very, Charles Champlin said he was a rugged individualist. Yeah. And like, there's just one story where Jim Graham, you know, his childhood friend, he describes he's sleeping and they had a 2-story building and this rock hits his window. Something wakes him up. He looks out the window, and now Jay Sebring's name was Thomas John Comer. Right. So at the time, so he looks out the window, and he's like gesturing to him, come on down. So Jim opens the door. He says, what are you doing, man? He goes, come on, let's go out. We're gonna go out. We're gonna walk around. And he He goes, Tom, it's in the middle of the night, man. He goes, my parents are right upstairs. He goes, what are you doing? He goes, come on, let's go. He goes, I can't go anywhere. It's like 3 a.m. And so then he goes, okay. And he goes, and by the way, don't throw rocks on my window. You're going to wake my parents up. And he says, so Tom or Jay Sebring says, well, that's okay. So next time, tie a long string to your finger or your toe and then drop it out the window, and I can pull on the string so you don't have to, so I don't have to throw rocks on the window. And I mean, and there are so many of these anecdotal, hilarious stories, but it's just who he was.
Right, right. Now, I mean, I guess just to put a bow on all this, because we don't get a lot of documentaries that are using the truth almost as a vector, as a sort of concept and a selling point. And I mean the pure truth, not like a variation of the truth or that kind of thing. And especially these days, given technology and given the amount of content and the demand for content out there, do you think this could potentially spark, God willing, sort of a movement to tell other stories, but at least tell them the right way?
Mm-hmm. I sure hope so. And I think that, Jay's life and legacy demand that and deserve that. And so many other people, their stories need to be known in a very candid, accurate way. Yeah. And also with the human dimension. So if we of course, Jay, and we look at all the different complexities of him, but I sure hope so, because I've always, over the years, I've always known that Jay's story in its essence, in actuality, was so much more interesting than what was sculpted about him afterwards.
Yeah.
And, it shocked me that people were they just had no regard for that. And I think in some ways, people who consume this type of trash, it feeds their insecurities, or their desires. Like, oh yeah, I'm glad to see that these people get struck down. Maybe I'm not doing anything that they were doing, but you know what? They got theirs. I don't know what it is, because I don't think that way. And I certainly don't know how I would feel had our family not been impacted by these horrible murders. But so that's something, but the bottom line is that truth. And it's, Johnny Bishop, again, kudos to him. And he was with me from day one, 12 years ago, and we were not initially getting paid. I mean, we've been paid a little bit, but really nothing, honestly. And Chad Lane with he just, when he jumped on board, things started happening. We got Jeff Beal and Quentin was doing it. So yeah, I just am so blessed to have a very small, talented, dedicated core of people. And, but he told me, Johnny did, he said, Ant, after working on this film, on Jay's film, he goes, he had worked on reality TV, he'd done different films and things. He goes, I will only do films, and this is really interesting to your point, that are specific to revealing the truth. Mm. And he says, I can make more money doing garbage. He said, but after working on this film, I have no interest in that. So maybe it is what you're saying. Maybe this is a catalyst or a fuse that is lit. But I know for a fact that Jay and all the victims are a hell of a lot more interesting. And certainly Jay's legacy is completely more culturally and historically relevant in universal ways on a large level than anything that was been sculpted about them,
For sure.
I mean, it really was. And once I started really definitively getting evidence and concrete proof, then I was like, there's really two Jay Sebrings. There's the Jay Sebring who lived and a Jay Sebring, I don't know if I'd say portrayed, but yeah, I'm pretty comfortable saying that, after he was killed.
And it's a reminder as well, especially this day and age, and on how we consume media and just being cognizant of that, because you can consume trash and you can even enjoy the trash, but you still have to acknowledge that it's trash.
Absolutely. And it comes at a cost. If you're consuming trash and you don't know you're doing it, well, it's on you and I say the hypothetical you, not you, but it's on you for not cross-referencing and not, if you want the truth, I think an intelligent person or a responsible person will do their research and they will get as close to the truth as possible if that is what their goal is. But if their goal is for trash and to suit their insecurities, that's what they're going to gravitate towards, and they'll just go with the first thing that makes them feel good.
Yeah, no, and you know what? I think that's a great note to end on. And you know what? Thank you again for the time today, and thank you again for the movie. It's really fantastic. I really appreciated it.
Well, David, I really appreciate you, but I'm not done talking, so we're going to be talking for another couple of hours.